In this lecture, we will introduce lists in Visual Basic. Another data structure that we can use in Visual Basic is called the list. Now, a list is actually very similar to an array. So it's also a collection of items of the same data type. So just as we can have an array of integers, for example, we can have a list of integers in Visual Basic. We can also access any individual element just like with arrays. So if I want to access a specific element in my list of integers, I can do so. So if a list is similar to an array, there has to be some differences, right? So how is a list different from an array? Well, there are two main differences. The big one is that lists have a dynamic size. So whenever we allocate an array, we have to specify the size. Whenever we create it, we have to give the number of the last index, which pretty much tells us the size of the array, or we need an initializer list. But here, we don't have to state the size whenever we declare a list. So what's nice about this is we can actually just add or remove elements as we run the program. So we can just say, we have a list. Initially, it may not have anything in there, but as the program progresses, we can add elements to the list. We can take out elements to the list. The other big difference is that we can have additional operations on the list. So we're not limited to just like getting the length of the list or the last index. There are additional operations that we can do, and these are provided as methods. The best way to describe a list in Visual Basic is it's actually pretty much just like a vector in Java, in that it's like a dynamic type list. With vectors in Java, you create an object of the vector class. Initially, there's nothing in there, but you can add elements, you can remove elements, and there are several other operations we can perform on vectors. So this is the vector equivalent in Visual Basic. Now, the way we would declare a list is a little different from how we would declare variables or arrays. Let me show you the format, and then I'll explain what's going on here. It's not a huge difference, but there is one key component that's worth noting. So here's the format on how we would declare a list. So we would have dim name as list, and the big difference is this parentheses. So we'd have a pair of parentheses, the word of, and then some type, and then we have to initialize it, or I guess instantiating is the proper word, but we would set that equal to new list, and then in parentheses again of type. So the name here is the name of our list, nothing out of the ordinary. So name is just a placeholder here. It's whatever we want to call the list. And then the type is going to be the data type that we use. So for example, if we wanted to make a list of integers, we would have in parentheses of integer in both places. So the big difference is that whenever we have the word list, we have to have in parentheses of and then the desired data type for our list. Let me show you an example of how we would do this. So here we're going to create a list of integers. So int list is the name of that list. So notice that we used to have dim int list as list, and then in parentheses we would say of integer to say that we want a list of integers, and then we have to instantiate the list. So we would say equals new list, and then in parentheses again we would have to have of integer. This is pretty similar to how we deal with vectors in Java, where we would have the angle brackets, or I guess you can call it the less than, greater than signs, and then you would put in the desired data type in there. So this is the equivalent to that in Visual Basic. I should also mention that this type can actually be any type. We can have lists of integers, doubles, we can even do images, strings, and even buttons. So we're not limited to just the basic data types for these lists. They can be any type that we want. We'll now take a look at some of the methods we can use for lists. The first method we'll look at is the add method. This method just lets us add the items to our list. Now the way this works is we would add the item at the end of the list. We don't add it in the beginning. We don't add it somewhere in the middle. We can't choose where it gets added. It's always added at the very end of the list. Now the way this works is we would put a value in the parentheses of the method, and the value that we pass would be the actual value that gets added to our list. What this means is the data type that's in the parentheses, the data type of the argument, must match the data type of the list. So for example, if I have a list of integers, if I call the add method, I better pass an integer. I can't pass a double, I can't pass a string, it would have to be an integer. So we just need to make sure that the argument type matches the list type. Let's take a look at an example of using the add method. So we first will create our list of integers. So we have dim int list as list of integer equals new list of integer. So we have our list of integers. Here we have a couple lines that allow us to add values to this list. So the way we do this is we would have to have the name of our list, a dot, and then add, and then in parentheses the values that we want to add. So the first line is adding the number 5 to our list, and then the second line is going to add 7 to our list. Once we've added these values to our list, we can access them just as if they were an array. So as an example, here's some lines that allow us to display the values in our list. So the first line is going to display a 5. So we see here the way that's being accessed is we have the name of the list, and we have our parentheses and the index. So accessing an element in the list is just like accessing an element in the array. And then the second line is going to display a 7. So we see here that we would display 5 and 7 in two different message boxes. Let's do another example where the add method is very useful. So if you remember from a previous lecture, we did an example of storing names from a file and put those names in an array of strings. We had to make some assumptions on the upper bound on the number of names in the file, because if we had more names than the array can hold, we would have a problem. What's nice about lists is we don't have to make that assumption anymore, because when we create the list, we don't have to specify the upper bound or the size of the list. We can just add each element as we go. So here's the same code from before where we would create a list, though. That's the difference. Instead of creating an array of names, we would have a list of names. So we have dim names as list of string equals new list of strings. So that creates a list of strings. We have our stream reader, so SR object. We would do some file stuff a little bit. And we have our while loop, where this does the same thing as before. The only difference now is that we're going to add the item that's read from our file into our list. So this line right here will take care of that. So remember, read line will read that particular line, which would be the full name. We use the add method and we invoke that on the names list, and the types do match. SR object.readLine is going to give us a string. We're trying to add a string into a list of strings, so we're good there. And we can just do this however many times we need to. And we can just keep doing this until we get to the end of the file. And whenever we're done, the size of the list is going to be however many names were in the file.